So once we admit or decide that in our experience of what we take to be the world, that all we can really know directly, immediately, and with certainty are sense data, or put another way, that all of our immediate and direct knowledge is subjective, you might say, although maybe we want to use that word carefully. But once we admit that, and that there is no evidence, no direct evidence for an external world at all, there's certain strange possibilities then emerge. And as Russell begins this chapter, chapter 2, The Existence of Matter, he admits that he has, in a way, argued himself into a certain strange position, and that is that perhaps it is that all he can really know, and therefore all that perhaps exists, are his own subjective sense experiences, and that the whole notion that there is an external world, a world independent of him, that he is in some sort of relationship to, is a dream. He begins this chapter by saying, in this chapter we have to ask ourselves whether, in any sense at all, there is such a thing as matter. And looking at what he means or associates with the word matter, whether there are any physical objects, whether there is an external world, whether anything exists apart from me and my subjective experiences. Is there a table which has a certain intrinsic nature and continues to exist when I'm not looking? Or is the table merely a product of my imagination, a dream table in a very prolonged dream? And he admits at the end of that paragraph, he says, this is an uncomfortable possibility, but although it cannot be strictly proved to be false, there is not the slightest reason to suppose that it is true. And I think that's an important remark to pay attention to understand what Russell's doing in this particular chapter. He's admitting at the outset that you cannot prove that everything isn't a dream, or you cannot prove that the external world exists. You cannot prove that the sense data you have immediate experience of, immediate knowledge of, you might say, you cannot prove that they relate to any independent objects in the world. It cannot be proven. However, he says, there is not the slightest reason to suppose that it is true. That is, although we cannot, strictly speaking, prove the existence of matter or physical objects or an external world, it so happens that the most reasonable position to take, the most sensible position, the most defensible position, he will argue, is the position that there is matter, there are physical objects, there is an external world that is independent of our sense data, of our sensations, of our own subjective experience. So he immediately goes on to talk about Descartes, and when we're talking about, doubting the existence of the external world, we're in Descartes' territory. Descartes, very, very important, incredibly important philosopher, lived in the 17th century and raised problems and proposed methods which are still influential and philosophers still concern themselves with. And with reference to Descartes, he says, well, where are we now? He says, although we are doubting the physical existence of the table, we are not doubting the existence of the sense data which made us think there was a table. So we may not know whether there is an external world, whether there is matter. We cannot doubt the fact that we have sense data, that is, that we have experiences, that there are appearances that are presented to us, and whether they relate to anything in the world that is real and independent of us, we don't know, but we can be sure of those. Now, Descartes, of course, very famous and for saying something, and it's quoted by Russell, I think, therefore I am, the cogito ergo sum. That is, if I am thinking, I must exist. The external world may not exist, but if I am aware of having any experience at all, that indicates that I exist. And Russell even throws doubt upon that when he says, but some care is needed in using Descartes' argument. I think, therefore I am, says rather more than is strictly certain. It might seem as though we were quite sure of being the same person today as we were yesterday, and this is no doubt true in some sense, but the real self is as hard to arrive at as the real table. That is, can I really be sure that I am the same person or the same being from day to day or even from moment to moment? He says, when I look at my table and see a certain brown color, what is quite certain at once is not I am seeing a brown color, but rather a brown color is being seen. So even our own existence as beings, and especially the notion that we continue as the same being, that we are the same being from moment to moment, is itself doubtful. So where are we really? What do we really know then? He continues, thus it is our particular thoughts and feelings that have primitive certainty. And that notion of primitive certainty is the idea that there is nothing more certain. When I look at a table and see the color brown, it is absolutely primitively certain that I am experiencing a sensation of brown, or the sense datum brown. There's nothing below that. There's nothing more primitive. There's nothing simpler. There's nothing more certain that could prove that. It's so absolutely certain in itself that it has primitive certainty. So again, where are we? We are in a position where we can doubt everything except the fact that we are having certain subjective experiences. So again, how would he proceed then? He characterizes the problem like this. The problem we have to consider is this: granted that we are certain of our own sense data, have we any reason for regarding them as signs of the existence of something else, which we can call the physical world? When we have enumerated all the sense data, which we should naturally regard as connected with the table, have we said all there is to say about the table, or is there still something else, something not a sense datum, something which persists when we go out of the room? That notion that we presume that the ordinary objects that we encounter in our everyday happenings in the world have an independent existence, and that they don't depend for their existence on us perceiving them. We believe that when we walk out of the room, having just seen a table, that the table still exists even though we're not experiencing it anymore, and that when we come back and experience it again, that it's the same table. Is that true? He says common sense unhesitatingly answers that there is. And what we see in this chapter is that Russell wants to defend that common sense view. Russell wants to make it respectable. Russell wants to characterize the questions that he's raised in such a way to defend, not absolutely prove, because he's admitted from the beginning that he can't prove it, but you might say to establish that the hypothesis, as he calls it, that there is an external world that is independent of our experiencing of it, in fact does exist, and that this is the best hypothesis for accounting for how our experience exists at all. So there's more to say about this chapter, a few more things. I'll try to keep it to one more video.